Susan Rice served as United States ambassador to the United Nations, national security advisor, of course, to President Obama in the White House, and is the author of the best-selling book, Tough Love, and joins me now. Well, Ambassador Rice, thank you very much for being with us. Let's start with that. Woodward kept in these conversations, especially after June 1st and the Lafayette Square conflict, returning to this issue of racism, systemic racism, and trying to get the president to talk about it, but you heard what he said, drinking the Kool-Aid.
Well, Andrea, this is one of the few pieces of the Woodward book and revelations that I don't consider to be news. It is not news that the president of the United States could give a damn less about people of color and African Americans in particular in this country. He is governed and he is a racist. And that's not news. What is a bit shocking is, how glib he is in his private comments about how he dismisses any concerns about systemic racism, police brutality, you name it. But it's not a surprise. And I think, frankly, of the many things in the Woodward book, this is the least informative.
Let's shift to, of course, the focus on national security. The man in your former job, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, along with his deputy, Matt Pottinger, warned the president all the way back on January 28th about the virus, how deadly it was, that it's a national security threat, in fact, the biggest national security threat of his presidency. And he dismissed it, claiming that he didn't want to panic people. It sounds, as you know him, and as you know him from the public record, because he's been panicking people every day about the so-called invasion of the suburbs by black people. So he's trying to protect the stock market, his view of the economy. What else is he trying to protect?
Well, I think back in January, he was trying to protect his empty trade deal with China and his, loving relationship with Xi Jinping, whom he praised repeatedly through much of the end of March. But what he was really trying to do was protect himself, Andrea. And the reality is, and it's tragic, and it's been driven home, emphatically by the president's own words on tape, is that we have a commander-in-chief who does not give a damn about the health and safety and the national security and the economic well-being of the American people. He is in it for himself. All he wants to do is be reelected at all costs, and make whatever money he can in the process through, whatever means necessary. And this is an extraordinary, reality that we're living with. Never in our history that I can think of have we had a president who really just doesn't care, and who is willing to do extraordinary damage to this country that we all love and depend on for his own personal political benefit.
One of the revelations is that he, in the context of Kim Jong-un, talked to Woodward about a secret nuclear weapon that had never before been disclosed. And when Woodward checked with military sources, they acknowledged there was such a weapon, but wouldn't disclose it because it was classified, and that they were shocked that the president would talk about it openly.
Well, I'm sure not going to talk about classified information, but the idea that the president of the United States, if in fact there were such a program, would reveal it to a journalist, knowing that a journalist would reveal it to the world, including to our adversaries, is the height of dereliction of duty. It's extraordinarily reckless and dangerous. And we don't know what the consequences may be and how our adversaries may react. So this is one more way in which the president of the United States has put the national security of the United States in much greater harm to serve his own ego and his own benefit.
He also talks about his praise for Erdogan, and he says at one point to Woodward, I don't know what that's all about, when speaking about liking strongmen, Putin, Erdogan, others, Kim Jong-un, the love letters between the two. How do you read any of that?
The only way I can read it, Andrea, is to conclude that the president of the United States, Donald Trump, has a very overt desire to be an autocrat, to be able to govern like an autocrat. He admires these dictatorial leaders more than anybody else. And whether that we're talking about Putin or Xi, of China or Kim Jong-un or Erdogan. These are all people who govern with an iron fist without regard for the well-being of their people. And in that, he has a lot in common with them. But to put the interests of the United States at risk for his personal adulation of these demagogic leaders is incredibly anti-American and does us great harm.
What is the obligation of a national security advisor when he or she tells the boss something so alarming and then hears it repeatedly denied and downplayed in public?
Well, the job of a national security advisor is to tell the President of the United States what he needs to know to keep the American people safe. By the way, I don't believe that was the first time that Donald Trump heard about the severity of the coronavirus. The U.S. government had known about it since at least early January. I think what may have happened on the 28th of January was that the National Security Advisor tried to make it clear to the president just what a grave threat this would be to his presidency. But the job of the National Security Advisor is to tell the hard truths. And if the president is not prepared to act on the basis of dramatic threats to our national security, which the coronavirus is, and simply to lie about it, to downplay it, and to ignore it for his own personal benefit, then in my judgment, any national security advisor worth his or her salt should resign and be clear about why they're resigning.
Susan Rice, Ambassador, former National Security Advisor, thank you so much for being with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.